Gir du meg tommel opp når du klar? Klart? Okay. Welcome to NUPI, everyone. Really glad to see you. I'm surprised and delighted to see so many people when it's raining outside, because that's usually a thumbs down for turning up. My name is Osman Velsin. I'm the Communications Director at NUPI. I'll be moderating the event today. And on the relationship between the U.S. and Asia, both in a geopolitical context and with respect to the connection between security and trade. This event is part of a project supported by the U.S. Embassy in Oslo, and the project consists of a series of events on U.S. foreign policy. So this is part of that series. We are very pleased to have with us Dr. Kenneth Weinstein. Am I saying it correctly? Perfect. Who is the Japan chair at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. today. He's an expert on the issues I mentioned. From 2011 through 2020, Dr. Weinstein served as the president and CEO of Hudson. And in 2019, he became the inaugural holder of the Walter P. Stern Chair, a position that he held until last year. He is widely published in American, European, and Asian media. Read quite a few of your articles and op-eds, and they're very interesting. He is currently serving on the advisory committee on trade policy and negotiations, and was in 2020 appointed by President Trump to serve as the U.S. ambassador to Japan. Dr. Weinstein's areas of expertise cover a wide range of topics, actually, but they include U.S. national security and defense and foreign policy, which, as I said, are the core of the topics today. We'll have a very simple program. Dr. Weinstein will talk for about 25 minutes, and so give or take, and then we'll open up for questions. So we'll end around 10 o'clock. Also have to tell you that the event is being recorded, so for questions, please wait for the microphone so we can capture your beautiful voices. So without further ado, let me present Dr. Kenneth Weinstein. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Weltsy, and you can call me Ken. I'm delighted to be back in Oslo, and delighted to be here at NUPI, and with respect to the director here. My topic for today, as Osman mentioned, is U.S. policy towards Asia. I thought I would begin with sort of a general outline, looking at the evolution of the policy, to how we got to where we are today, and then end on sort of differences between the Trump and Biden approaches on China in particular. And my talk is largely China-focused. I don't talk much about North Korea, but we can go into that in the Q&A. So let me just say to begin with that for decades, U.S. policy towards Asia really was centered on promoting growth and economic development in China under the belief, which I think we all know is now misled, that a prosperous China open to the world would become more liberal and more democratic. And that led from the Nixon's famous visit to China on to an effort to include China in, to give China most favored nation trading status, to give China, to push for China's admission into the World Trade Organization. But over time, doubts developed as to what China's intentions were, most particularly under Xi Jinping when he became General Secretary of the Communist Party. We saw a more aggressive face of China, not the China that was biding its time, as Deng Xiaoping used to say. And instead, it was a China that had a more aggressive stance towards building islands in the South China Sea, a more aggressive stance towards territorial claims in the South China Sea more broadly with regard to the Philippines. We saw, obviously, the takeover of Hong Kong and Xi Jinping's repeated statements that reunification with China was key to the rejuvenation of the great Chinese people. And so it was Donald Trump's 2016 campaign that really heralded an end to this era in U.S.-China relations, with Trump's heavy focus on the trade deficit, heavy focus on deindustrialization, particularly of the upper Midwest, which was key to his presidential victory in 2016. His view that America needed to take an America first attitude towards policy, that we could no longer be altruistic to the rest of the world in terms of making concessions on trade, particularly to developing countries, in order to bring them into the world order. And as it turned out, as Trump's campaign put China really at the forefront of the policy debate, at the same time we saw China moving aggressively to promote its One Belt, One Road policy, seeking to make sure that kind of all roads lead to Beijing, which I will return to in a second, through infrastructure investments, both digital and roads and the like, and maritime sea lanes and the like. And so, and at the same time, we saw the rise in Japan of a remarkable leader whom I knew quite well, the late Shinzo Abe. And it was Shinzo Abe who had been formed by his grandfather, late Prime Minister Kishi, his father, the former late Foreign Minister Shintaro Abe, and it was Abe's belief that there was kind of there was a need first for the great democracies of Asia, the United States, Japan, India, and Australia, to work together to face the China challenge, and that more importantly, as Abe outlined in a 2016 speech on economic development to the UNCTAD conference in the summer of 2016, he called for a free and open Indo-Pacific, meaning an Indo-Pacific that was free of coercion, in which there could be there was open trade, there was open navigation of the seas, and there was no coercion of neighbors. And it was this policy that Shinzo Abe developed that later became U.S. grand strategy in a remarkable moment. And I think President Trump doesn't get enough credit for this. That's the first time in American history I can think that a major strategic doctrine proposed by an ally became U.S. policy. And it was both at the Trump-Abe meeting in November of 2020, just 2 weeks after the U.S. election at Trump Tower, and later at the Mar-a-Lago summit in 2017, February 2017, as the United States was seeking to look for an alternative to the One Belt, One Road policy. It seemed that Shinzo Abe's FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific policy, with its focus on rule of law, freedom of navigation, democratic allies, seemed to be the most effective means to challenge the Belt and Road. And Abe's real aim in the Free and Open Indo-Pacific was to reconnect first, put India on the map in Asia, and to reframe Asia from being China-centric to the Indo-Pacific, which is a much broader map, including Australia and the United States as well as India. And so it's not simply China-focused, but it is focused both on the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, believing that through the convergence of these two seas, as he called it in a 2007 speech at the Indian Parliament, that global commerce could really flow effectively. And this fit into the emerging consensus then in the Trump administration. You have to remember President Trump came into office concerned about the trade deficit with China, concerned about China being a manipulator of currency, concerned about wheat, soybean sales. But over time, as he underwent briefings from particularly the CIA and Mike Pompeo, he came to understand the geotechnological threat that China over time posed, whether it be through undersea cable systems that China was trying to put in place through One Belt and Road, whether it be through Huawei attempt to dominate 5G systems, whether it be through Chinese e-payment systems that were becoming popular in Southeast Asia. And in particular, it was obviously Belt and Road, facilitated by targeting of elites in these Southeast Asian countries and elsewhere, including in Africa, the use of bribes, preferential shares in companies that drew elites in these countries to overlook the shoddy nature of this infrastructure at times, and as well as the predatory rates of these loans. And so over time, there was a strategic convergence between the United States and Japan, in which the United States, under the Trump administration, reformed its development finance institutions, creating the Development Finance Corporation that could take equity stakes in infrastructure and technology, energy investments. There was a deepening of cooperation between the U.S. and Japan on development, the U.S., Japan, and Australia. The formation of what was called the Blue Dot Network, which was an high-quality infrastructure network designed to pose a challenge to Belt and Road. And lastly, there was the exposure of the predatory rates that Belt and Road was offering countries, and it did have a significantly negative impact on the fate of Belt and Road and the direction of Belt and Road projects. Now, in addition, as I mentioned earlier, the geotechnology threat, the China 2025 program aimed for China to dominate the heights of cutting-edge technologies, including quantum and AI, biotechnology, green energy through massive state subsidies to state-owned enterprises and the like, and at the same time with civil-military fusion taking place, in which civilian technologies were being used for military purposes. There was a growing fear in the United States, and particularly in the Trump administration, that as we enter the big data era, that China would have an unmatched edge in global competition by collecting data, whether it be through Huawei, undersea cables, health data, and the like. And so there arose a real attempt to counter China's attempt at geotechnological superiority, the anti-Huawei campaign, which largely succeeded in the first round on the 5G, on shutting down Huawei's 5G capabilities, particularly in Western Europe, on the building of underground cables and the like. But these concerns grew worse and spread to other areas during the outbreak of the COVID virus, which really set back U.S.-China relations significantly. I don't think there's much doubt that among most serious intelligence analysts in the U.S. that the virus emerged out of the Wuhan laboratory, out of gain-of-function research that was probably funded by, that was almost certainly funded by the U.S. government and U.S. nonprofits as part of, at sort of which was a remnant of the high point of U.S.-China technological cooperation, which we thought was going to help transform China. But we saw China leverage its PPE equipment during the early phase of the crisis, and we grew increasingly aware in the U.S. that we were dependent on China for not just for precious metals and rare earths, but for aspirin, for chips, and so much of our supply chains had been outsourced to China. So the result was a refocus in the United States on economic security as key to trade, no longer a focus on seeking out the low-cost providers, and these concerns obviously were magnified after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And instead, we had seen, beginning with the Trump administration and continuing with the Biden administration, a focus on homeshoring, on nearshoring, and on industrial policy in particular. And I'll return to these questions in a second. On the security side, simultaneously to the trade side, we saw, as I mentioned earlier, this growing Chinese threat, whether it be the open threat to Taiwan, whether it be the threats, and we've seen this in the last few days, to the second Scarborough Shoal in the Philippines, whether it be the buzzing of the Senkaku Islands, which are administered by Japan, or the open warfare between China and Russia, between China and India in Dakhlan. And so we've seen, beginning with the Trump administration, the revitalization of the Quad, which had been left dormant for about a decade. And we also saw deepening of U.S.-Japan security ties in a significant manner. And So much so that Japan, with its major new 3 major security document strategies that it released at the beginning of 2023, is doubling its defense spending, and most recently has asked the United States to change the kind of command we have at U.S. Forces Japan, so that decisions for Japan would be made on Japanese soil by an American commander with his Japanese counterparts, and not made by the newly renamed Indo-Pacific Command, which is based in Hawaii. And the renaming of the Indo-Pacific Command from the Pacific Command was another sign of the impact of its Indo-Pacific strategy. So we have seen now in the Biden administration, which has continued many of these policies, but I'd argue in a less effective deterrent manner, to put in place what it terms a lattice strategy for U.S. Allies and partners in the region, to move away from a hub and spoke system, which we had, where the United States was individually linked to all these partners and allies, and instead to sort of try to interlink our partners and allies in the region. And we've seen very successful multilateral cooperation developing. First, and this is full credit to Prime Minister Kishida, but mostly to President Yoon of South Korea in August 2023. We saw the U.S., Japan, South Korea trilateral, and the deepening of now military cooperation between the 3 countries. We've seen April 2023, the historic U.S., Japan, Philippines trilateral summit, which was at the White House the day after the U.S., Japan summit. We've seen President Marcos reverse his predecessor Duterte's China-friendly policies to move towards giving the U.S. access to key bases in the Philippines in the case of a Taiwan contingency. And we've also seen strong U.S. Willingness to cooperate and to help defend the Scarborough Shoal if needed, with firm reiteration of the U.S.-Philippines treaty requirements. And so similarly, I think we have now seen an attempt to boost Taiwan's defense. We have sent advisors into Taiwan, just as we did into Ukraine during the Trump administration, to help the Taiwanese think through the kind of scenarios they are likely to face. There's obviously, President Biden has spoken repeatedly that the United States would defend Taiwan in case of a Chinese attack. At the same time, though, our defense spending is lagging, and we are the only country among the NATO partners whose percentage of GDP spent on defense is actually going down, because the Biden defense plans Biden's spending is primarily on the domestic side, and the defense spending numbers actually have not been keeping up with inflation. And so, and I'll turn to Taiwan in a second, but I think as we look at the competition with China, it is a multifaceted competition. It is economic, as I mentioned. It is strategic. It is diplomatic, and China obviously has been playing a role, claiming to be a leader of the global South, and creating a kind of coalition of have-nots, if you will, as opposed to the West. Done so effectively both during the Ukraine crisis and now during in the aftermath of Hamas's bloody attack on Israel. And it's also a strategic crisis. And so it's we're at a challenging moment in the competition between the 2 countries. This is not simply, as my colleague John Lee of Australia says, it's not simply a kinetic, my Hudson Institute colleague, it's not simply a kinetic challenge. It is a challenge over ideas. It is a challenge over structures of international governance. And the question is, how can we attempt to constrain China's behavior and shift China's behavior at this crisis? And so I think, you know, as we look at the Trump campaign and the Biden campaign and what they're likely to be saying about China, I think we can come to some interesting conclusions. I think, first of all, I think the Trump campaign very much thinks economics is absolutely at the heart of the China challenge, and so he is President Trump's proposing the 60% tariffs on goods from China, and he is very clear that he wants to decouple our technological development and technological capabilities from China, wants to end our reliance on China, remove most favored nation status, while at the same time restoring our deterrent internationally, which I would argue has been weakened since the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan and also the removal of the sanctions on Nord Stream 2, both of which I think played a critical role in convincing Putin that he would have an easier time in Ukraine than he did. And I think that the Trump campaign is likely to, and Trump himself is likely to put a greater emphasis on military affairs than the Biden team has. I mentioned already the real defense cuts that we've seen. I think you're going to see an expansion in military cooperation with the Philippines, possibly with Vietnam and Indonesia, as Robert O'Brien, the former National Security Advisor, suggests in a forthcoming article in Foreign Affairs. You're going to see a massive increase in security assistance to Taiwan in particular, and also a shift of Marines, potentially, as O'Brien suggests, out of the Middle East and to the Indo-Pacific. At the same time, I think you're going to see an end to the delusion that we can somehow cooperate with China on climate change, which has led a lot of the Biden administration's thinking. And I think the Biden administration, in turn, I think will continue to, if the president's reelected, will continue to try to work on climate with China. As I mentioned, will continue to focus on minilaterals, will continue to place tariffs on key sectors in China, but will also attempt to invest more in America's EV sector. And this is another difference between the two presidential candidates. President Trump firmly believes that electric vehicles are a subsidy to the upper middle class that leaves us more dependent on China, which is a source of critical minerals and has the kind of cutting-edge battery technologies that we do not have. And it was in particular Ford, which has turned to a Chinese producer, CATL, to license production of cutting-edge batteries for its facilities. The Biden administration, when it was approached about giving subsidies under the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, for CATL's new factories, approved it in the belief that climate was a greater threat than China. That is not the Trump administration's feeling, and I think you would see that those kind of factories probably shut down if Trump is elected. And I think you'll see more of an attempt really to place a focus on hard security in the Trump administration. And let me just add that I think, lastly, there's a significant debate in Washington going on about the relative importance of the European theater versus the Asian theater. Less of a focus on the Middle East theater, despite the current crises that are ongoing. I would say that in terms of President Trump, I don't believe the rhetoric that he plans to withdraw from NATO. His focus is on NATO spending and is on NATO deterrence. He was not pleased with. He did not trust Angela Merkel as leader of Germany. Thought she played him on trade. Thought she played him on Nord Stream. Thought she played him on defense spending. And the more that European countries do to promote European defense, the easier it will be. The easier the future of the alliance will be. President Trump's already gotten a lot of what he wanted in terms of increased defense spending, but I think he's also more likely to be more willing to forward position troops in Europe, pull them out of Germany, push them back towards Poland, which he wanted to in the first place, and all by way of saying, I think he would like Europe to bear more of the burden on Ukraine going forward, and I think that that is the best thing that Europe can do for its own security, as well as because the Indo-Pacific is our priority theater. It is the pacing threat, as the Biden administration likes to say, and it's the area that we're going to need to focus on moving forward to restore the deterrent in the Taiwan Strait, to restore the deterrent at Scarborough Shoal, the Senkakus, and elsewhere, at a time of major global challenges that are pressing in very significant ways, including, which I didn't even mention, the Chinese nuclear program. So on that note, that's a broad outline of a lot of different things. I tried to follow the path that Osman laid out in his email to me, and happy to move to discussion. Thank you.
Why don't you sit on that side?
Great.
It's a little bit better. So I'll open up for questions in a minute or so, but I'll let you guys ponder on some good questions while I use my right as the moderator to ask the first one. Well, thank you for this broad outline. The order, so to speak, was very broad, so pretty difficult task to handle, but it was very interesting. So if I heard you correctly, you mentioned and you went through quite a bit of the descriptions of how the U.S. perceives the threat from China in economic terms, in security terms, and strategically as well. I interpret the long-term goal, so to speak, on China, and the goal of U.S. policy is to shift Chinese behavior on these fronts to mitigate the threats, basically. So, but could you say a little bit about what are the top long-term goals on U.S.-China policy and Asia policy in wider sense?
Yeah, look, I think first of all, I'd say that I think they differ between the Biden administration and the potential new Trump administration and the first Trump administration. I think the Biden administration early on bought into the concept that the attempt was not to transform China, but that it sought to constrain the environment in which China operates, and which it stated very clearly in its national security strategy and its Indo-Pacific strategy, whereas the Trump administration had a different objective the first time around. I think that President Trump, I think he's underappreciated as someone who's for his knowledge of foreign policy and what he attempted to do. I think his sense was that he came in thinking that the challenge was soybeans and wheat and currency manipulation, but he ended up leaving understanding the challenge was this geotechnological challenge that rested significantly on intellectual property theft from the West. And so through the trade agreement that he tried to get with the Chinese, the big focus on the first round of discussions, where the United States thought it had an agreement, which then shifted later on, if you remember going back to 2018, 2019, the attempt was to put in place a new kind of trade agreement with a very strict enforcement regime that when Chinese intellectual property theft took place, there would be a massive snapback of tariffs. And the Chinese at first agreed to this, but then eventually realized what was going on, and they backed off of this in the agreement that was signed right at the outset of COVID. And I think President Trump's hope was to transform, in some sense, the Chinese economy by putting massive pressure on it. And I also think Secretary Pompeo, as Secretary of State, offered a series of speeches at the end of, towards the end of the Trump administration, beginning, I guess that's the summer of 2020, in which he talked about the challenge posed by the Chinese Communist Party and the need to empower others, the need to sort of focus on the Chinese Communist Party in particular as a not especially popular institution in China, and one whose unpopularity needed to be highlighted in an attempt to sort of open up the political discourse in China. And we have seen over time various best-selling books. There was a book that recently came out about repression in Iran. There was a novel that was actually really about China, and these books take off like crazy. That sort of proves that hypothesis. I'm not sure that Trump administration is going to come back with a specific sort of plan along those lines. But from what I am gathering from discussions in Washington, and these are not with the Trump transition team, I think there's a growing focus on people on the right and center right on the need to try to exploit China's economic weakness, which we have seen. It failed to come out of COVID with massive economic growth. We still have the real estate crisis that is going on. Although most recent quarter economic growth seems to be stronger than it was, I think there's a real focus to sort of think through what the pressure points are on the Chinese economy and what can be done to make sure that Xi Jinping needs to do more to bolster his domestic popularity in the face of and it's, look, it is very challenging when you deal with you talk to Chinese when they're, it is a very depressing time in China. You see people graduating from college without job opportunities. You've seen a tech sector that is increasingly decimated, the non-governmental side of the tech sector, since Xi Jinping decided to declare war on Alibaba and on WeChat and all these other rising tech giants. You see undergraduates who are very uncertain of job opportunities. You've got the massive demographic challenge of single-child families having to support parents, and so I think there's a sense among some, and I recommend this new piece that my Hudson colleague John Lee and his wife Lavinia Lee wrote. They were Australian researchers on, which just came out the other day, which talks about how to think about a long-term strategy of dealing with China when victory is not going to be possible, but how do you place constraints on what China does? How do you sort of focus it to not focus so extensively on military buildup, on nuclear buildup, and on pressuring its neighbors?
But would you say that the long-term strategic goal of U.S. policy, China policy is some sort of coexistence with a constrained China? Is that what you're saying?
I think the long-term goal of U.S.-China policy is to protect and defend our democratic allies in Asia and their partners, and that will require us to seek to significantly constrain China's freedom to engage in the kinds of operations that Xi Jinping would like it to. And so the focus for our strategy is less. We need to focus on China, but our real interest is making sure that the first island chain doesn't fall, making sure that Taiwan remains democratic, making sure that Japan remains strong and independent, and making sure that the Philippines don't, that the Scarborough Shoal, second Scarborough Shoal doesn't fall, and that we find questioning of broader U.S. alliance pledges throughout the world.
Exactly. Okay. So one more question from me, and then I'll give you the word, Sverre, and I'll see you, Karsten. Just wanted also to ask you, because the differences between the Biden administrations and Trump administration was you said quite a few bits about that, but would you say overall are the differences on the strategic level? Do the different administrations have different strategic goals, or are the differences more on the types of processes and measures and than the nuts and bolts in the
they're definitely different. They're definitely different strategic goals. I'd say first of all, I think the Biden team kept in place a lot of Trump's policies on China, the free and open Indo-Pacific. They raised the Quad from a ministerial level to a head of government level. There were a lot of things that were kept in place, but I think that the Trump focus is on deterrence, and that has always been Trump's focus. I think he instinctively understands deterrence from his days as a real estate a person, that you can get up from the table, you can leave, you can make claims, you can leave your your strategic opponents off balance, whereas I think that the Biden administration has been more focused on clearly telegraphing to its allies what we're about and its adversaries, with the notion that that is the best way to avoid confrontation. It frankly didn't work in the Middle East with regard to the outreach to Iran. It didn't work with regard to Ukraine, where the attempt to attempt both diplomacy and to dovishness with regard to Putin. We saw what that was left with, what the results were. So, and I think Trump will be much more focused on a message of deterrence going forward, and that is the major strategic difference, and also a major buildup of our armed forces would be the other thing that President Trump's going to do. But I think the other points, the deep cooperation with Japan, the U.S.-Japan, South Korea trilateral, the U.S.-Japan-Philippines trilateral, all those things will continue to move forward. And including the Pacific Island outreach, which the Biden administration has made a major focus. They've reopened embassies in some of the Pacific Island countries where we hadn't had them for a while. It was Vice President Pence who went to Papua New Guinea, I think, in 2018 to deliver a major address, and all those things I think will continue to deepen going forward.
Sverre?
Thank you very much. I'm Sverre Strandhagen from the Norwegian Business Daily, Dagens Næringsliv. Thank you, Mr. Weinstein, for an excellent lecture. I have a question about the upcoming NATO summit in Washington, because I understand that the Biden administration has been it's very important for them that the Indo-Pacific partners should participate. What is your take on that? Is it because they are afraid that the focus on the summit will be only on Ukraine and not about China? Is that a point?
No, thank you. It's wonderful to see you again. This time here in Oslo. I think there is a big focus at the NATO summit on the IP4, the Indo-Pacific 4 partners. That's Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea. And I think the message the Biden team wants to impart is that, as Prime Minister Kishida said many times when he was head of the G7, when Japan headed the G7, what's happened in Europe can happen here in Northeast Asia. And so I think the notion, they're trying to promote the notion that the European theater and the Pacific theater are somehow joined, and that Japan has played a critical role in aid to Ukraine. South Korea has become a major source of arms for countries that are assisting Ukraine. And Australia and New Zealand have also played their parts. I think that's what it's going to be. So it seems as there'll also be a U.S. IP4 side summit, I believe, and potentially a U.S.-Japan Korea leaders summit as well. But I think the Biden administration would be wise to depoliticize the NATO summit to make sure that this is not about, that the summit doesn't exist to attack President Trump's campaign, President Trump, in terms of the vision. And I think the NATO allies understand that.
Karsten?
I'll stand up. My name is Karsten Friis. I work here at NUPI. Thank you very much for an excellent overview. 2 questions, if I may. First one on the nuances between Europe and the United States when it comes to China. We like the term de-risk, instead of decouple. And the argument is that we shouldn't, cancel everything. We should keep, let's say, the safe trade open. Salmon, in the case of Norway, it's the difference between 5G and salmon, put it bluntly, right? So we'll comment on that, those differences across the Atlantic. And secondly, on China and Russia, I mean, over the last couple of weeks, we learned that the Chinese support for Russian warfare is much more substantial than we have known. Much more dual-use equipment that has come from China into to Russia, been very important in the continued warfare. So what's your take on that? What can we do to make China be less engaged, less supportive of Russia? Thank you.
To another pair of excellent questions. Yeah, look, on the decoupling, de-risking thing, I think Trump wants to decouple the areas of technology, wants to end our dependence on China. That doesn't, toilet paper, toothpaste, salmon, non-technological goods are okay to trade with China, and I think it's fine. Where it gets thorny is on the question, for example, of electric vehicles, and particularly within the EU now. We now have this agreement that Xi Jinping just signed with Orban in Hungary to start producing EV equipment and eventually, I guess, EVs in Hungary, which risks undermining the ability of Europe to stand up united with the United States and potentially Japan to face the Chinese EV challenge. And I think there's some division also among German automakers as to just how dependent they ought to be on the Chinese side of both their supply chains and their markets. But I think that because once Hungary, once the camel's nose is under the tent, it's going to be hard to stop. But I think that's an area that the United States would like to work closely with Europe and Japan on going forward, whether it's the Biden administration or the Trump administration. And President Trump is particularly concerned about the role of Chinese EVs in Mexico, with the fear being that there could be over time a shakedown on the oil market and that Chinese EVs will find themselves getting into the United States. Right now they can't under the U.S.-Japan, USMCA, the trade agreement between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, but who knows what future directions will go because of domestic content concerns. The second question, no, I don't even remember. The second question was
Russia, China.
Russia, China. Yeah, no, it is. Look, it is. I was at Shangri-La, and it was deeply just. You heard the remarks by President Zelensky about the depth of Chinese engagement. It's disturbing. We knew about the heavy Iran engagement with the Russians, the heavy North Korean engagement, Iran producing these Shahed drones that have really helped Russia turn the corner, and Russia building its own alliances, deepening them in a sense, while our allies were kind of asleep at the wheel in terms of providing further assistance to Ukraine. With regard to these dual-use technologies, I think we just need to confront China on this, expose the intelligence, and do what we can to prevent these kind of technologies from either making it to China or making it out of China. But it is very hard to do. Look, Putin has also broken the sanctions with regard to North Korea, both by giving North Korea cash and fuel in exchange for these rounds of, or the 1 million rounds of artillery and the like. I mean, the good news for the West is these rounds of artillery are apparently not that reliable because they're North Korean quality, but he really has brought North Korea back into the global mix. The coming Putin visit to Pyongyang, the first one in decades, is quite stunning. The president of the great nation of Russia would debase himself to deal with a rogue nation like North Korea. Sort of shows the direction of world affairs, and it's and there I think the Russians are playing themselves against the Chinese with regard to North Korea. The Chinese don't. There's obviously long national tensions between the Koreans and the Chinese that date centuries. Xi Jinping was quite heavily involved in that in the efforts that led to the 2017 sanctions being put on North Korea that at the UN, and he has backed off of those. But Putin has done much more, and done so in a much more dramatic fashion, and so North Korea seems to be much more reliant now on Russia than it was on China. So it's an interesting development with all sorts of strategic implications.
I have 3 more persons. So first Henrik, and then Paul in the back, and then Charlotte.
Yes, I'm Henrik Wiig. I'm professor at the Oslo New University College. I'm an economist, not a political scientist, and I'm concerned about trade and free trade. And as you took the example of electric vehicles, you actually impose a large import duty on Chinese cars into USA in order to stop it. And one of the explanations for doing this is actually that they are some kind of unfairly subsidized. But what we observe from Europe is that United States is introducing the IRA, a heavy subsidy for which is really competing with our industry of new sustainable energies and technologies. And could you explain to us a bit about the idea of these huge subsidies, state subsidies to the industry? You took an example of actually subsidizing a production plant. How can you actually this cope with free trade and the whole idea of trade and having also competition with the rest of the world like Europe?
Yeah, at first, I think there's a recognition in the United States that the era of kind of naive free trade is over, and that we're into a period where we're trying to on both sides of the aisle promote something closer to fair trade. That requires us to be able to do what we can to bolster our domestic capabilities at manufacturing through industrial policy, out of a recognition that should there be an invasion or a blockade of Taiwan, there would be a crisis with regard to the global chip supply that would make anything that occurred. And remember, there was that period of a number of months in during COVID, where there were not enough chips for the automobile industry alone to sustain itself. And so so I think there is a dramatic need to develop our ability to manufacture and develop our own high-end chip production facilities, and also lower-end chips, just to make sure, just for the sake of economic security. I think that's different than what the IRA was about. The IRA was an attempt by the Biden administration to put in place to sort of push for what people in Congress thought of as the Green New Deal, to sort of make a major dent on the threat of climate change by putting money into U.S. industrial policy. It was done in a manner that was distinctly unilateral, with major provisions put into a bill. No one has yet claimed to be the person who authored the various provisions that excluded Europe, that excluded our Asian allies from some of these subsidies. And and the way that the bill is now being implemented, there seems to be some backing off of some of the key provisions. But it was as unilateral. It was far more unilateral, I think, than anything that Donald Trump ever did, given the size of the bill that went through, the magnitude of the bill, the impact it would have on European industry in particular. And I think Europe, more than the United States, feels squeezed with regard to the automobile sector, where you have fewer and fewer major automobile manufacturers. You have the German sector, which is largely dependent, not exclusively, but largely dependent on China. When you look at Audi, you look at VW in particular. You have a French industry that is facing major challenges, whether it be Renault or Peugeot. And so, I am not a fan of the IRA. I wouldn't have pushed it through. But the argument was climate change is such a major crisis. We need to address it right now. And in fact, when you look at the numbers, it's not EVs that are doing more to eliminate carbon emissions. It's actually hybrid vehicles, which people want to buy. They're not simply an upper middle class subsidy. They're preferred not just by city drivers, but by rural drivers. Their carbon footprint, the reduction in carbon footprint is much larger at this stage than it is under EVs. And then you had the contradiction, as I mentioned earlier, with the Biden administration deciding that IRA subsidies, which were designed for American manufacturers, are going now to Chinese manufacturers like CATL. So I don't believe in that policy. I don't support it. And I think it would be, we'd we'll have to see what President Trump does if he is elected as to its implementation. But I think we're definitely, unfortunately, going in that direction moving forward. But at the same time, we're seeing massive pressures with interest rate increases on the size and focus of our deficits. I think there was a delusion in the United States that both Republicans and Democrats had that we could get away with budget deficits because inflation, we had sort of largely cured inflation, and so the interest rates we'd be paying on the debt would be significantly less, and that's not the case right now. Well,
thank you for coming to Oslo to enlighten us, Mr. Weinstein. My name is Paul Frisvold. I'm a politician from a party that's, let's say, closer to the color of your tie than to your suit. I have two questions for you. One, Mr. Trump says he will end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. How is he going to do that? And my second question alludes to what you just spoke about, tariffs on Chinese vehicles, who are not only over-subsidized, but they are mobile spies with a very sophisticated software that they can control and is a threat to our society. What do you think about the fact that the Norwegian government, contrary to our allies, the US, and our European allies, the European Union, is now opting not to do as their allies and introduce tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles? Thank you.
Thank you. Look, I applaud you as someone whose political views are closer to this color than to this color to stand up against Chinese electric vehicles, unlike the Biden administration. No, the spying implications are definitely critical, particularly because China, I should have mentioned those, because China also has taken the lead in autonomous driving technology, which involves geospatial mapping and the like, and deep concerns about data being sent back. And I'd be lying if I said I wasn't disappointed in the Norwegian government for not standing up to this. I noticed this. I was in Norway last summer on vacation, primarily in Tromsø and in Bergen. I noted more Chinese vehicles here. In Austria also I've noted them, but the rest of Europe I have not seen very many of them, I have to say. As to the Ukraine war, I think Trump, when he says he's going to end it in 24 hours, he doesn't mean, 20. What he's saying is, and I think he's outlined what he wants to do. I think, I think Trump is oftentimes misunderstood as a policymaker. I think Trump's view of policymakers, people like ourselves, is that we lack imagination. That oftentimes the solution to a crisis means really stepping back, and that as insiders we lack perspective. And I think he felt he brought perspective to Manhattan when he built Trump Tower. And I think he feels that we oftentimes think of the kind of, we look at a situation and we think that the options run from the letter L to the letter P or Q, whereas for Trump it runs from the letter A to the letter Z. And so it means Fire and Fury and Rocket Man in North Korea, but also means beachfront condominiums and a brand new North Korea if you denuclearize. It means massive tariffs on China, but a new trade deal that's going to end intellectual property theft and transform China without China being fully aware of it. With regard to the Middle East, it means maximum pressure on Iran, but a new Iran deal that would end the regional activities and deter the regional activities and the missile program and the nuclear program, and start a new phase of relations with a transformed Iran. And I think, as you think of Ukraine, I think what Trump has said, look, he basically he was going to call Putin and say, you stop attacking the Ukrainians, or we're going to go give a ton of arms, more than you could ever imagine, to the Ukrainians. And he basically said he was going to call Zelensky and say, you have to accept things the way they are. We're not going to be there for you. And so I think from that general outline, I think we can see what I think Trump wants to achieve, which I take it to be, we need to do as much as we can to bolster Ukraine. And when I say we, I mean we, meaning we, the people in this room, meaning that the burden is on Europe moving forward. We've got to be focused on China. Europe needs to step up creatively to figure out a way to guarantee Ukraine's security. The United States will have to play a role. We know that. But we don't want to be the ones, we don't want to be on call 24/7 with the massive, picking up the expense, and because it also raises the ante that China will take action knowing that we are tied up in Europe, or that Iran will take action knowing that we're tied up in Europe. So the more that the Europeans can do to take this off of the Americans' plate, the better. And I think, I mentioned Robert O'Brien's forthcoming article in Foreign Affairs. One of the things he talks about is that Ukraine would be admitted to the EU as part of, which I think would be an important step forward for Ukraine. And I wouldn't even doubt there might even be a serious path to NATO membership for Ukraine as well, if the Europeans can figure out, and it's not an easy challenge, how Europe can play a much more critical role in defending Ukraine. And I think what President Trump doesn't want is to pull out. He's not going to do a Biden-style withdrawal from Afghanistan, which humiliated the United States on the world stage, couldn't be explained. And you have to remember, the Afghan withdrawal, when in the Trump administration in the last year, the administration was very clear. The word was given to the Taliban: you mess with the United States, you're going to pay a major price. And there were very few Americans who were killed in that last year before the withdrawal. And I think Trump's understanding of the withdrawal was a withdrawal with a deterrent of some kind that would stay in place. I don't think he would have given up Bagram Air Base, which he said, and I don't think he would have. I think there would have been air cover. You would not have had the situation that you had at the airport in. It was a kind of wishful thinking that somehow the United States was the cause of the problem in Afghanistan. If we got out, the situation would be solved. And it was just a naive stubbornness of Joe Biden that period. And it was actually that moment, I think, where people started to have severe doubts, where they saw that Biden was neither the foreign policy expert that he claimed to be, even though Robert Gates said he had, was wrong on every major foreign policy decision for the last few decades. He was neither competent, nor did he seem like a nice guy, because he was just very blunt and unable to defend himself or his policies in those moments. And I think it was at that stage that he really started having his major drop in popularity that continues today.
Okay, time has run quickly. We have room for only one more question, and it goes to Charlotte.
I will be very quick. I think, so I'm Charlotte. I work here on Japan at NUPI. I think I'm one of the few in the room who care about Japan more than I care about China. I wanted to maybe bring the conversation a bit back to how you talked about economic security and Japan's economic security policy and Japan's two-facedness in dealing with strengthened US-Japan ties on one side, and then actually seeing Keidanren and political business meetings going back to China that started now this year. I just wanted to ask you how you view this two-facedness.
Yeah, look, I view it in several ways. I think there is a desire to continue sort of the lower levels of trade with China, no doubt. But I also think that there's some doubt about American willpower and America's commitment to Japan that leads the Japanese to fear that we will not be there for them if a crisis does erupt. And that is something that is extraordinarily dangerous. And it is those kind of doubts about America's value as an ally that have, that lead countries to kind of hedge their bets. And it's normally the smaller countries that do so rather than Japan. So I would say now it's very critical that we continue to show our determination, but also that we do so in a manner that doesn't inflame the situation simultaneously. And the Japanese are known for, for walking softly. I think we need to be known for walking softly and carrying a big stick with regard to China. We can't be known for walking softly. We can't be known for not carrying a big stick. But we need to do both, and to do so in a serious manner that if it's an ally, and it shows Japan that we have their back. And as Japan is increasingly showing that it has our back by its fundamental defense transformation. So.
Okay. I think we have to end there. I have so many more questions. There are so many other topics that we should have spent at least an hour on Taiwan.
Yeah.
But that has to happen at some other time. Thank you so much. This was very enlightening and very interesting. Thank you for showing up, and thank you for all the good questions. Let's give Dr. Weinstein a good hand.